Hello and welcome everyone to the November edition of the VolunteerMatch Solutions Best Practice Network webinar series. I'm Casey Brennan from VolunteerMatch and I'll be moderating the session today. We're extremely excited to have Sarah Kerkian from Cone Communications on the line with us today. She's going to be discussing the findings from the agency's global research study, which was exploring the consumer expectations of companies to act responsibly in the market. I had the personal pleasure of having Sarah as my mentor for many years and can tell you personally that she is the go-to person to find insights and resources about cause engagement and corporate responsibility. So I'm very excited and pleased to have her on the line today. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone that to ask a question, you simply need to type into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. You can also submit questions via Twitter. Send them to @VM_solutions using the hashtag BPNCone. We'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the session, and Sarah will field those as appropriate. And if we don't get to your question, what we can do is have Sarah follow up with you after the session is done. Another reminder is that we will also be distributing a recording of this session tomorrow, so no need to take rigorous notes. You'll get a copy of this at the end. So without further delay, I'll hand the presentation over to Sarah. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm thrilled to be joining you and VolunteerMatch to share our latest research. Go ahead and get my screen set up here. So I'm excited to share Cone's 2011 Cone Echo Global CR Opportunity Study. First, I'm going to tell you just briefly about Cone in case you're not familiar with us. What we do is we strive to build brand trust among key stakeholders for companies and major nonprofits. We have 5 core disciplines. We specialize in public relations and marketing across cause branding, corporate responsibility, nonprofit marketing, brand marketing, crisis prevention, and management. And we really look to build relationships between companies and leading organizations to address social issues that also have business return. We have created industry-leading research for the last 18 years, the most recent, of course, I'm going to be talking about today. And we work with world-class clients. I mentioned Fortune 500 companies and leading nonprofits. We've developed programs you might be familiar with, like American Heart Association's Go Red for Women, Play Save Lives to Save Lives, Timberland Earthkeepers, and many others. So without further ado, I'd love to jump into the research. To give you a little bit of background on how we conducted the study, we partnered with Echo Research, which is a global research firm that specializes in corporate communications and reputation analysis. We conducted the research back in June among 10,000 adults in 10 key markets. It was split about evenly between men and women, and it was nationally representative in each of the countries where we tested. Those markets were the United States, Canada, Brazil, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, China, India, and Japan. In addition to the data, we talked to an expert in each country, a CR thought leader, to really help us put the data into context of the key drivers for CR. What are the economic and political and social forces at play that could be impacting consumers' demands and desires? And so overall, it's about 1% plus or minus margin of error globally, and then within each country, it's about 3%. Sorry about that. So why did we conduct this study? Cone, as I mentioned, has been doing research for 18 years, and it's always been focused in the U.S. It's where we're based, here in Boston. But we really saw the need for greater insight into some of the key markets where our companies operate, and other companies are looking to develop programs that really meet the growing stakeholder demand for more responsible business. You can see our first stat, 94% of consumers in the world's largest countries want to see more companies support worthy issues. It's sort of hard to ignore a stat that significant. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to understand what were the things that mattered to them. Another thing is that companies we're realizing are really essential to addressing these social and environmental issues because they have resources at their disposal that a lot of governments and NGOs do not. So they can really help sort of complete the picture in terms of addressing these key issues. And if there's one takeaway, I'll start with a takeaway before I even share the data. It's really that when you look at CR globally and cause marketing globally, it's that customization is a must. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. And so I hope that you'll take a look at the data I'm going to share globally, as well as some of the key insights for each country, and consider what that means for programs in different markets. So consumers have set the bar really high. As you'll see from this slide, they're saying you must go beyond operating legally. You really have to look at how your business impacts society and evolve your business practices to make the impact as positive as possible. So here's one of our foundational questions. It's about the role of business in society. It's something that we frequently ask to really gauge what do consumers expect of business on the most basic level. Is it about just earning money? Is it about supporting the communities where they operate? And what this slide shows us is that 81% of consumers expect companies to do more than just make money, or more than even just support their local communities. Those bottom three pieces of the pie represent that 81%. And they're looking for companies to support issues with donations and time. They're looking for companies to advocate for change. And they're also looking for companies, the largest percent, to change the way they operate. So throughout the presentation today, I'm going to give you just a little bit of a snapshot of some of the interesting global findings. I know a lot of you are probably focused on domestic programs, so we're going to look at the global data generally, but just some of the really interesting takeaways. And I want to note that in our full report, which we'll share at the end, the URL for that, there's a lot of deep data for each market. So if there's a country that's important to you, you can certainly get more information. So here for the role of business in society, in the U.S., one of the strongest, in the United States, people want it all, so they were very similar to what you see as the global numbers, but 27% believe the role of business is to advocate for change. In China, similar, but more than half think the role is to advocate for that change. And in Brazil, one of our most progressive countries, probably the most progressive, more than half of the respondents said that the role of business is in society to actually change the way it operates. We also took a look at location. Do consumers care whether a company is supporting an issue locally, in their own communities, nationally, or globally? And when you look at the global findings, it's pretty much split. We have 30% global, 36% local, and 33% nationally. But this is when we start to see some really interesting divergence among the countries. So some of the larger countries geographically, like the U.S., Russia, and China, had a strong preference for companies to support local issues, which is sort of intuitive if you think about sort of the vast space that country entails, the number of states or provinces or communities or what have you. In Japan, it's the only country that really said focus nationally. I think that's reflective of both the earthquake they experienced, which was before we fielded this study, as well as the fact that it's an island nation. And finally, some of the emerging countries like Brazil and India said take a more global look. So this is probably going to be quite interesting to a lot of you. We looked at the issues that consumers care about. So this was a closed list. What the issues you see in front of you on the slide were the only ones that we asked. We strove for issues that were globally relevant, that were broad enough that they would apply to each of the countries that we tested. And the first thing we did was just ask, how important is it for a company to address these issues? So what you'll see here is, somewhat and very important on the left and very important on the right. And if you look at these issues, it's pretty clear they're all important. This is table stakes. Anywhere from 87 to 96% of consumers say these issues are important for a company to address. When you look at very important, there's a little bit more differentiation, but there's still anywhere from about a half to 2/3 of consumers say these are key. So we dug a little deeper because we really wanted to understand what is that key issue for consumers. And so we asked them if there were only one issue that a company could support, what should it be? And far and away, it was economic development. You see 34% of consumers globally in the markets that we tested said this is the key issue that they believe companies should address. It's followed closely by environment at 21% and human rights at 12%. I think it's interesting when you look at these top three issues. They really are all in a company's wheelhouse. So it shows us that consumers seem to understand where companies really can have the most impact based on the way they do business and the things and people that they touch every day. Another takeaway for economic development is that it's really a macro issue, and I think it's an issue through which all these others can be viewed. So I wouldn't interpret economic development to be truly just microfinance, kiva.org. It certainly could be that, but it could be any of these issues really, because from poverty and hunger to education, women's rights, no matter what the focus, it all sort of filters through economic development because you have to have a strong community, region, and people in order to raise all these issues up. In the U.S., economic development was quite strongly the #1 issue, 43% here as compared to 34% globally. In China, environment was a priority. I think that's a little bit indicative of both strong environmental regulations as well as a lot of environmental issues. It's a key challenge there, as we know. And in Brazil, education, although not the #1 issue, it was a close second to economic development at 20%. So we took these issues. This is a little bit of a heady chart, so I apologize, and this is in the full report if you want to take a closer look. But we asked, if a company supported the issue that you care about most, what would you be willing to do? So everything from be more likely to trust the company, to want to purchase from that company, to wanting to work for it or even have it in my community. So the takeaway here is that if you support an issue that your consumers care about, they're willing to reward you with everything from their loyalty and purchase intent all the way to license to operate. Just a quick example now that we've talked about economic development being a key issue for consumers as well as local. Starbucks' new cause marketing campaign, Create Jobs for USA, is sort of the perfect example of a program that focuses on economic development as well as focusing locally. If you're not familiar with this program, they just launched it. It went into effect on November 1st. And essentially, consumers and employees can buy a $5 or make a $5 donation. They'll get that indivisible bracelet that you see on your screen right now. And 100% of the donation goes to the Opportunity Finance Network, which is an organization that helps to create jobs. And the math behind this is that for every $5 donation, $35 in community financing can be unlocked. And so ultimately, they're looking to create, with $3,000 in a donation, they can create 1 new job, sort of the thinking behind it. So in addition to the consumer participation piece, Starbucks is kicking in a $5 million donation to this organization as well. So just thought this was a perfect example to highlight how one company in the U.S. is supporting a key issue to consumers. All right, so in addition to the key issues, we also wanted to look at what are the business approaches, how should a company address these issues? And once again, consumers expect companies to use their entire portfolio, everything from donating all the way up to changing the way they operate. They all matter. And we see that reflected in the very high percentages on both of those columns on your screen. So once again, we took a little deeper look and said if there were only one way that a company should approach the issues that you care about, what is that way? And clearly it's changed the way they operate. 31% of people said this is the way a company should tackle key social and environmental issues. Once again, if you look at the top 3, it reveals some interesting insight into the consumer mindset. Obviously change the way they operate, then apply unique business assets, which we explain to our respondents as technologies, research, things like that, at 19%, and then developing new products or services. So it's pretty clear that consumers still recognize that the resources and assets that businesses have to put to work. In the U.S., which we call the traditionalists, we'll talk about briefly later, they were the one country that cited making donations most as a key way for companies to address social and environmental issues. It still was low on the list at only 11%, but stronger than any of the other countries we tested. In Japan, 29% want companies to develop new products and services, so not too surprising coming from what we might consider a hub of product innovation. And in India, it's all about speaking out and awareness. So talking about changing the way they do business, changing operations being the key way consumers want companies to address issues. Here's just a few examples. You could cite dozens, hundreds. Every day the news reports all kinds of exciting innovations, everything from sourcing to packaging to actual operations, manufacturing facilities. 3 simple examples to share with you. Chipotle has sort of has its entire brand equity in sourcing locally, sourcing fresh ingredients, and being transparent about what's in their food. And they also recently made an announcement that they're going to source more local as much as they can. And they have some pretty impressive goals around the amount of food that they want to source locally, including 5 million pounds of local produce, and eventually hoping to reach 10 million pounds. So they're taking a business model that's already been focused on fresh, natural ingredients and really trying to even enhance it more by sourcing more locally. The second example is Puma's Clever Little Bag. This is a new shoebox from Puma, and I believe it's coming out. It was announced in 2010. I believe it's coming out sometime around this time. And this shoebox is actually, bag and carry. It takes 65% less paper to make. It reduces water, energy, and diesel consumption by over 60% a year. And it's actually reduced the company's carbon emissions by 10,000 tons a year. And then ultimately, once the consumer leaves the store with their shoes in this bag, it's a reusable bag that they can use again and again. And finally, the last example there on the bottom is Hilton's Worldwide Lights Day, which is a program that is helping the company and its guests make a lot of environmental strides. Through simple consumer actions like inserting a key card into, to ensure that the lights come on, and then when you leave and take that key, the lights go off when you leave your hotel room, to having iPads in some rooms that will replace the need for printed materials like guest services and room service menus. It's actually saved the company about $74 million last year across all of its 10 hotel brands. And of course, it gives consumers a lot of options to directly impact this issue themselves, beyond just reusing their towels. So speaking of consumer behavior, we looked at a lot of different ways that consumers either have engaged in responsible behavior in the last year or would be willing to if given the opportunity. And some of the key takeaways are that they're willing to reward, they're looking to purchase products. What you see on the left side of this graph, the 76% reflects the number of people who report they have purchased a product with an environmental benefit in the last 12 months. The 94% reflects the number of people who say they would if a company gave them the opportunity. And you're going to see this little gap again and again as I share some more key findings. And it really represents some equity left on the table. I think the numbers are incredibly high in terms of what consumers say they have done in the last year, impressively high. But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity for companies to provide the opportunities to engage consumers even further. So purchasing a product with an environmental benefit is certainly one. Purchasing a product associated with a cause is another. 65% say they've bought a cause-related product in the last year, but 93% say they would if they had the opportunity. This is an interesting takeaway. As we looked at these 10 key markets, certainly cause marketing in the traditional sense, as we might define it, where you buy a product, a portion of the sale goes to a charity, doesn't necessarily exist in all these markets. So this is where the insight from our experts in each country really came into effect. And we talked about this question: how could so many people say they bought a cause-related product? And the takeaway was that the definition of cause is incredibly broad. It's diffused into different cultures in many different ways. For example, in India, the thought is that there are a lot of wealthy heads of family-owned companies that make contributions to the communities where they operate philanthropically. And purchasing a product from that company, in essence, is buying a cause-related product to people. Another example may be buying a locally sourced product from a vendor down the street. So sort of the net is that it doesn't necessarily mean a ribbon on a product. It means buying a product where you believe that you're giving back to an issue or issues that matter in a variety of ways. Some of the other activities that consumers are engaged in should be particularly interesting to a lot of you on the line. Volunteerism. This is an area where we saw a little bit lower participation. 39% have volunteered in the last year. And I think that's because, once again, in different markets, it's not necessarily a culture of volunteerism service or philanthropy. But what this gap tells us is that consumers are pretty open to companies being a social partner. So 39% have volunteered, 78% would. And the distinction in this question, when we only asked about have, we didn't specify with a company. We just said in general, have you volunteered as an individual? But when we asked would you, we said if it was an organization that a company you trust supports. So there was that added layer that if a company was engaged, a company they trusted, they would be willing to volunteer. So perhaps it was a turnkey opportunity, it would increase their participation. Higher donations, 63% have and 81% would, but still the message is the same. There's a great opportunity for companies, of course in the U.S. and around the world, to be a social partner for consumers and provide those types of opportunities that they may be willing to participate in but are not seeking out on their own. Finally, the other side of the coin, we talked about the positive, we have to share the negative. Consumers are quite willing to boycott companies for irresponsible or deceptive business practices. More than half said that they have done this in the past year, and 93% said that they would if they heard about something negative. So this is neck and neck with those, willing to purchase, willing to donate. So it's certainly something to consider. Consumers are also willing to speak out. Not as many have, only about a third. But once again, we see a strong inclination to do so if they hear negative information. And about a third are proactively researching companies' business practices or their support of social issues. So on one side of the coin, they're willing to buy your products and support you, volunteer and donate. On the other hand, they're just as willing to go to another brand if they don't like what they hear. Communications. So most consumers want to know what companies are doing. These are global figures, so it shows us that marketing a cause or marketing about a corporate responsibility initiative is accepted. It's certainly, in some cultures, it's about being more humble and not showing that you're sort of benefiting directly from that marketing communications, but ultimately consumers want to know what you're doing. And they also want to be heard, so they're looking for a two-way dialogue. At the same time, there's some challenges. There's a lot of skepticism. 89% say that companies, or believe that companies are sharing only the positive information while withholding the negative. And 71% say they're confused by the responsibility messages companies are using. So there's a lot of opportunity to use these key channels we're going to talk about to really overcome some of that skepticism and confusion by being transparent and clear and providing some educational messages. So this is a little bit ironic. So our consumers told us that they want two-way dialogue, but yet the channels where they want to be reached are more traditional one-way channels. They're practical. On the product or package is the #1 way. They say companies should reach them with messages about cause and CR. Media is a close second, and that's earned media. We positioned it as stories or interviews in their local papers. And then finally, advertising. So those are the top 3 most effective channels to reach consumers. However, we shouldn't ignore social media. When you combine the 3 sort of related categories of mobile, social media, and websites, it takes us to 21%. So it really pushes that category right up into that upper echelon as well. And a great message, back to the transparency point. Most consumers, 88%, say it's okay if a company is not perfect as long as it's honest about its efforts. So they're not expecting saints. They're expecting you to be forthcoming about the good and the bad. Here's another recent cause marketing example that really hits home given packaging being the #1 way consumers want to hear about cause and CR. You may have heard the big announcement that Coca-Cola has rebranded its Coke cans, the color of its Coke cans for the first time in its history, changing them to white. In addition to the regular Coke cans, all Coca-Cola products will have a Arctic home, polar bear, white cap on the bottles. As you can see here, the cardboard packaging includes messaging. There's a huge advertising push. I know I've seen it in movie theaters, on the homepage of the New York Times, and a number of other places already. And so, as I mentioned, this is the first time Coke is changing the color of its can, and each time the messaging will prompt consumers to make a text donation of $1 to World Wildlife Fund to protect polar bear habitats. In addition to matching the consumer donations up to $1 million. Coke is kicking in its own donation of $2 million. And so this is pretty much as straightforward you can get as reaching consumers with on-pack messaging around a cause. We expect this to be one of the most buzzed about cause campaigns of the holiday season. And now to talk about some of the really exciting positive messages that came out of this. We talked about consumers willing to boycott and the risks that are possible. But at the same time, companies are really demonstrating an impact, and consumers are seeing that. 93% say that companies have made at least some positive impact on the world. A quarter say the impact has been significant. And we actually see that number grow significantly in some of the emerging markets that we tested. So showing that people are seeing these efforts on the ground. 68% say that a company's efforts has improved the quality of their own or other people's lives. 59% credit companies with helping to educate them on important issues. And 56% say they're inspired to support something new. So we think these numbers are really exciting, not only for the companies on the line, but also for the nonprofits, because it shows us that cause marketing, cause branding, corporate responsibility can really help to elevate awareness around key issues. So whether a consumer is supporting that company specifically or might just start to learn about a new issue and take strides to support it themselves, it's definitely raising the bar. In terms of impact, one great example, Pampers 1 pack equals 1 vaccine. It's a partnership with UNICEF between UNICEF and P&G's largest consumer brand. They address neonatal tetanus, and for each pack of diapers purchased, this program's been around for a few years now, 1 vaccine will be donated to mothers and children in need in certain developing areas. What's exciting about this, and the reason I'm showcasing it, is that this started as a small pilot in Western Europe, and it was so well received that it just exploded. And today they can say that the disease is close to being eliminated. They actually, the World Health Organization measures expect this to be completely eliminated by 2015. So it's an example of a cause marketing, consumer-facing program that really has made strides on a specific issue. And as a result, Pampers is actually one of UNICEF's largest corporate donors, and they've also seen year-over-year growth for this brand as a result in some of the toughest markets where they operate. I want to just briefly touch on country insights. I've alluded to some of the key takeaways in each country. We're not going to dive deep into each market here because I know a lot of you are focusing more on domestic programs, but please be aware that we do have deep data and insights for each of these countries that you see highlighted in our full report. We have even more than you'll see in the report, so certainly don't hesitate to contact us if you have additional questions. Along the right-hand side, you see some of the organizations that we partnered with, including BSR in France, the Center for Corporate Citizenship in Germany, CSR Asia, number of organizations that really gave us a lot of deep insight into the cultural influences in each country and the consumer expectations. You'll find in our report we broke out each country by giving sort of a personality. We wanted this to be approachable and understandable. We didn't want it to be too heady and difficult to sort of translate into action for our companies. So, for example, I mentioned before we call the United States the traditionalist. That's because more than any other country, they care about philanthropy and volunteerism. At the same time, they expect companies to change the way they operate, so they really expect it all. We call Canada the middle ground. Canadian results neared the global averages across nearly all the questions that we asked. So if you're curious about how Canadians responded, you simply need to look at the global averages. They're not going to be the first movers, but they're not going to be the laggards either. They want to be comfortably in the middle, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's a resource-based economy. So they have to be respectful of the fact that their economy is based on mining and oil and forestry. So that's certainly a key consideration in cause-related and corporate responsibility initiatives. We've highlighted some of the stats from Brazil. I mentioned this is probably our most progressive, and therefore we call Brazil the progressive. Quite eager to participate with companies, incredibly trusting, looking to be educated about the issues and how they can be impacted or impact the issues themselves. we found after speaking to our expert in Brazil, who is currently with Instituto Acatu, who also founded the Ethos Institute, which you might be familiar with, that the CR and cause movement in Brazil really stemmed from an activist media. So it's a pretty sophisticated environment for cause. The media first were reporting on all the wrongdoings of companies, and they would include the name front and center. But anytime they talked about something positive, they wouldn't necessarily cite the company. So there was an incredible need for companies to really be transparent, to communicate, to work with the media, to get their stories out there. And as a result, consumers are fairly educated and actively engaged in learning about the efforts of companies. So that's just a few examples. We certainly have more for each country, and I would love to talk more afterwards if anyone has questions about those, or certainly please take a look at our full report. A few key takeaways in general globally. I mentioned in the beginning, each market requires unique programs to engage the consumers, to acknowledge sort of the cultural nuances of that market, to ensure an effective campaign. Our contact in Russia mentioned that a lot of CR and cause programs in Russia fail, and that's because foreign multinationals will come to Russia with a ready-made program that might work in the UK or in other regions, and they sort of rubber stamp it, cookie cutter it, whatever you want to call it, but they don't consider and do their research to understand how consumers there want to engage and what sort of issues and communications are effective for them. And so unfortunately those programs fail, which has made CR a difficult subject in Russia, and has sort of driven a lot of short-sightedness. So sort of one takeaway there. The roles and perceptions of stakeholders, this is key. This is certainly one of the interesting findings, not necessarily from the data, but from talking to our experts, is that each country has its CR champions. Each country has its sort of the cost of doing business. If you're in a certain market where a lot of the regulation and communication is happening from the government, you certainly need to engage with the government. If you're in a country where, like China or Russia, where NGOs are not trusted, where there's a lot of scandal and challenges, to do a traditional cause program and put a nonprofit logo on your product or communications is probably not going to be doing you any favors. So there's definitely different stakeholders and champions in each market. We talked a little bit about this. Philanthropy and volunteerism are not the cultural norm in every country, but there's an incredibly strong consumer desire and willingness to join corporate efforts. And so this is a point that gets me very excited, because I think that this calls for more cause marketing, corporate responsibility, volunteerism, and philanthropy initiatives, because sometimes that's all a consumer needs to really get engaged. They are socially inclined, but perhaps they don't know how to sort of filter through those issues and those needs. But a company that they trust can really help to help them navigate that space. Business has the opportunity to differentiate and lead, especially in developing nations. People there seem to recognize some of the constraints of governments, of NGOs, and see business as a solution to those challenges. There's a definite need for business to address these issues because they are inherent to the sustainability of the business. So it's sort of a two-way street, and I think that a lot of the countries we spoke to are sort of still trying to figure out how corporate responsibility and cause marketing, philanthropy that's corporate fits into their social contracts. Traditionally, they're welfare states where the government has driven all those types of needs. So business can really be a champion and sort of start to change the paradigm for how all sectors engage around these issues. And finally, of course, this goes without saying, but companies can be, or consumers can be advocates if companies use frank and honest communication and sort of break down those barriers around skepticism and consumer confusion. The trust that we see is so high in emerging markets. It's exciting, but also precarious. So through transparent communications, companies can really develop some strong consumer advocates for their initiatives. So I thank you so much for your time. I hope you found this information valuable. I want to share, we have many materials available on our website at coneinc.com/globalcrstudy. You'll find the full report, as I mentioned, as well as our press release, a fact sheet, a brief video to give you a little taste of some of the key findings for the countries. So please take a look, and I guess I'll turn it back over to you, Casey, for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. We do have several questions, and if you have any that have come up, please submit them through the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll have plenty of time before the end of the session here to get to as many of those as possible. One thing that I kind of wanted to quickly address before we go into too many of the questions, and something that was of particular interest to the VolunteerMatch team, was the gap that we saw, Sarah, between people saying their willingness to volunteer or to donate, and you know, how many people actually reported doing so. So there's a huge gap there, and as you discussed, it's really a huge opportunity for the companies to kind of get those people engaged. And I just wanted to quickly share a couple of examples that we've seen that you know, with people that VolunteerMatch Solutions works with. And also some other people in the marketplace that have done a really great job of getting people involved. So I'm just going to quickly pull up on my screen a couple of examples just to show people of people who have really done it right. REI is one of a VolunteerMatch client who we help to manage their consumer initiative. But you'll notice that they've dedicated actual space on their public website to getting people out into their communities to volunteer. So really they're seen as the intermediary of allowing people to search for opportunities, show their impact, and really kind of get involved in a lot of the, you know, the outdoorsy nature involved initiatives that they can do in their local communities. So that's a really great example of kind of using the assets that they have to empower people to do good. And again, it's kind of closing that gap of people who say they want to, but they don't know how. REI is sort of the person helping them do that. A second one is Coca-Cola's Live Positively campaign, which you'll see here has many different facets to it. Sarah mentioned also their cause marketing campaign where they're changing the actual packaging, but here's another example of all the different ways that they're getting involved in the community. Again, another partner of VolunteerMatch, where people can actually search for volunteer opportunities on their Live Positively website. And another one that isn't a VolunteerMatch client, but that I've just seen over the last several years is Virgin Mobile's Free Fest, which actually rewards consumers with a free concert ticket if they record 8 hours of volunteer time. And I believe that they've done this over the last few years. And again, it's just a really great way specifically to get youth involved and also rewarding them for doing so. So again, just a few ways that companies can really help close that gap as they're trying to kind of encourage kind of more responsible practices and getting recognition for it. So I'm going to get into the questions that have come in. Sarah, the obvious one that's come through is, what was the biggest surprise that came out of this global research that you conducted?
Oh, great question. So I would say it's twofold. You know, this is the first time we've done global research, so we weren't incredibly surprised by the findings among consumers. We know, and you know, consumers want to support these efforts. They want to purchase cause-related products. We were surprised by the global nature of that, and that's why that we really engaged these experts to understand how can so many consumers want to buy cause-related products. And so that was one. The other is sort of the just zeal in emerging markets. It blew us away. The numbers are strong throughout this report, and you saw it in the presentation. But when you look at Brazil and India and China, you know, 99% of people would say certain things, and that's an incredibly, it's a number you can't ignore. And we saw that time and again across those three markets in particular. Brazil being one of the strongest. That's why we named the progressives. Just far and away across every question we asked, every opportunity to engage, they, you know, were right there. And I think, as I mentioned, there's really this sense of sort of a sophisticated understanding of responsible business, as well as some, you know, domestic and global challenges that need to be addressed. Another one that was surprising to us, UK, we actually call them the cynics. And, you know, we always look to the United Kingdom as a leader in corporate responsibility in particular. There's also a lot of cause marketing that happens there, sort of being more progressive than possibly the United States. And so to find sort of a bit of ambivalence among the consumer respondents was surprising to us. But that was quickly sort of explained away when we spoke with our expert there, because CR in the UK is really focused on investors. The business case is pretty solidly proven, and it's about addressing those business risks that could inhibit, future growth, to sustain its current and future growth. Consumers are more concerned about their own wallets, and I know that's true in every market, of course, in the U.S. as well. But it seemed particularly true there. They've, not only experienced the global recession and financial troubles, the riots. There's a lot of sort of social and economic forces at play, and so it was pretty clear that this is not an issue they care about. There's also a lot of regulations in place, so businesses sort of have a higher bar of responsibility at the base level than perhaps some other countries. So that was surprising. So I guess that's both sides of the spectrum. You have the incredibly progressive in Brazil and India, and then a little bit more cynical in the UK.
Great, and that goes back to your point, Sarah, that you made at the beginning, which was that there's no one-size-fits-all for the entire globe. It really needs to be very customized in the way that you approach your kind of corporate responsibility in each market.
Right, and I also, just to add, I think it's a good point, but I don't want to scare people off to think that a program, you have to create a new program for every country. I think it's about a lot of, multinational companies, they have a lot of different issues that they address, material issues from the environment to, more consumer-facing social issues. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to create something from scratch for every market, but you might communicate a little bit differently, or you might emphasize or magnify an issue in a market more than you would in another country. So for an example, right now in the U.S., of course, you're going to talk about economic development because that's, it's a priority issue. It's something we're facing. We're seeing it through Occupy Wall Street. It's in our daily news every day. So it doesn't necessarily mean a program from scratch, but it means just sort of thinking about how you can tailor your existing programs and issues to be a little bit more relevant to those consumers.
That's great. Thank you. I actually have a very specific question that came in. It says on slide 22, you explain that the data about consumers volunteering, or is this about company employees volunteering? So I'm just going to quickly show that slide again to the audience. So again, the question is this about consumer volunteering or employee volunteering?
This is about consumer volunteering. So again, the 39% refers to consumers who say they have volunteered in the past 12 months as of the time we conducted the study, and 78% refers to consumers who say they would volunteer if given the opportunity to support an organization that's supported by a company they trust. So it's all consumer-based.
Okay, great. And then somebody else actually asked the question, Sarah, consumers say that they want to see, commitment to a cause on pack and on the labels of things, but, there's this whole trend that's happening where more of our sales are going online, and how does that sort of impact the way that companies communicate with their audiences?
That's a good question. I think, one thing to remember is that looking at the global data, we did talk to consumers. They were online adults, so certainly they have access to the internet, but I think a lot of the shopping is probably still happening in store or in markets. My perspective is that communications should be 360. All of your channels should reflect the social or environmental issues you're supporting, the volunteerism or philanthropy initiatives that you have underway. It shouldn't be relegated to one communications channel. And I think when you do look at the breakout, as I mentioned, when you combine sort of all those social and online categories, it really does become a pretty important, it puts it right up there, I think at number 1 or number 2. So it's not to say it should be ignored. I think it's a pretty obvious practical connection to say it should be on pack. But at the same time, as consumers are buying online, the message should be in front of them there as well. And in a place that's easy to find. They shouldn't have to dig for it or read a detailed report. It should be pretty easy for them to access.
Great. Thanks for the advice. Our next question, Sarah, I know you're going to love this one because it's the age-old question that I know we've experienced in the past, which was, did the study involve any financial quantification of how sales can be impacted when companies take part in cause? And I'm wondering, and I know this is an age-old question that's really actually difficult to report on and get to, and I just want to express that to the audience. It's something that organizations have been tackling for a really long time. It's like, what can I expect my ROI to be in translating to bottom line sales if I take part in this initiative? And it's really difficult to quantify because it has a variety of factors that are impacting it, and it's also hard to measure. But Sarah, is there anything that you can say about expectations of how this will impact the business if they take part in one of these types of initiatives?
Sure. Thank you for the caveat. That was very helpful. Yeah, of course, that's the most difficult thing to measure. If we had that, if we had that answer. But I think that we do have some previous data from our Duke study a couple years ago that proved consumers. There was an actual behavioral study in a lab setting, but we set up a grocery store, and it proved that consumers were more likely to buy the products that were tied to a cause. So we do have some behavioral data we could certainly get to you. I think that when you look at these numbers, it is self-reported, and so we have a number of wonderful statistics that tell you that consumers are more likely to buy a product. And what I sort of take away is that, yes, it's self-reported. There is a social desirability factor. Consumers will tell you a little bit more what they, think you want to hear when it's an online study. But at the same time, if you have those numbers, we're still talking about millions of consumers and millions of potential dollars. So I think it certainly can have an impact on business. We see that it has an impact on business. If you look at, P&G's Pampers and UNICEF program, they're doing it because it has virtually solved this issue, but at the same time, they're doing it because it's driving their sales in markets that are difficult. So that's, entirely the intent of cause and CR is about driving both business and social return. So while these data points don't directly tie to specific financial return, I think there's plenty of examples, and through our own Duke, data that showcases there is definitely a financial return possible.
Great. Sarah, one of the things that you talked about was the issues that people find important. And in the question that came through is specific to that. You mentioned how Starbucks is sort of addressing the issue of economic development with their sale of their bracelets on site to support economic development. But not every company or organization can choose that whatever is the hottest topic of the day to support, because then everybody would be supporting the same issue and nothing would be unique. So the question is, so how does an organization choose a cause to support, something that I would imagine makes sense for them and that also is sort of meeting the consumer demand? Can you give us some advice on that?
Yeah, that's a great point. If everyone supported economic development, that would be a challenging environment for those companies to stand out. And I think that it's a growing sort of question as we see more and more companies engage in cause. The marketplace is getting a little bit more saturated, although I would argue it is not saturated because we still see 94% of consumers globally think companies should be doing more. But to find the right issue, I mean, it's a process. You certainly have to look at everything from your objectives and key audiences, but to your, the assets you have at hand, the amount of money you want to invest in marketing. But at the end of the day, sort of to boil it down, if you support an issue that is aligned with your business and that is important to your consumers, you'll be successful. I think there's certainly something to be said for addressing the big issues and the major nonprofits, but at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity in supporting more niche issues. You just think, Haagen-Dazs supporting honeybees. I mean, that's an issue that has direct implications for their business, not necessarily the most emotional issue or one that's even in anyone's radar outside of a small circle, but they've really brought that issue to the attention of consumers and made it something meaningful to them, giving them a way to participate and addressing an issue that is core to the business. So I don't necessarily think the key is to say, okay, let's go and create an economic development campaign. The key is to, do a little research and strategizing to understand what issue do you impact as a company, what issue can you stand to have good impact on as a company, and what issue do your consumers in particular care about?
And I think to your point, Sarah, you also kind of learn how to tell that story. Supporting the honeybee population maybe isn't the most emotional, but I think what Haagen-Dazs did a really great job of over the past couple of years is really telling that story and making it relevant to consumers and telling them, maybe you didn't care about this, but this is why we care about it, and kind of pulling them in and getting them engaged in that as, an issue for them that is really about the sustainability of their business, because if they don't have the honeybees, they can't continue to manufacture their ice cream. So again, kind of hitting on that emotional point for consumers is really important.
And you mentioned education. I think that's so key. There's not a lot of education that's needed for some of the bigger issues that we're familiar with and may experience in our day-to-day lives. But when you look at an issue like that, I mean, I think what was so successful about that campaign is they took an issue that no one really even realized was an issue, and they explained it to us. And it goes back to those points that I mentioned around impact, that consumers might be inspired to support something new or be more aware of an issue thanks to the marketing, communications, and education that company is promoting. So I think that's a really exciting opportunity for companies. It's not necessarily the easiest one, but I think that's where companies stand to make a lot of difference.
Great. And we have a couple more questions coming in. I encourage everybody, if you have any more, please ask them now as we finish up today. Sarah, the next question is about the holiday season. This is a big time for companies to be showing their commitment. It's a really kind of a family-oriented, emotional time in this country. And is there anything, you mentioned the Coca-Cola campaign, but are there any other themes that you've seen about companies and supporting issues during this time of year?
Yes, and we see it every year. It's tradition. This is, we always do a little landscape analysis of the cause campaigns that come out around the holidays, and every year it's sort of going back to Cause 101 basics. Buy a pin-up at the register. Come into our store and make a donation. We'll give you a coupon. It's very much about sort of the basics. It's very much about tradition, supporting issues like hunger, underprivileged children. I think it's not the time where we see, we might see bold commitments or, unique approaches like we do with Coca-Cola's Big Change, but it's still a pretty foundational campaign. It's not the time we're going to see incredible innovation. It's really about tradition. Macy's Believe, having kids come in and bring, their letters to Santa in exchange for donations to Make-A-Wish. There's nothing really more traditional about the holidays than writing letters to Santa. And so then it also has the added benefit of bringing, foot traffic into Macy's stores. It's pretty brilliant. We see a little bit more of social media happening with Coca-Cola. There's a texting element, which, by the way, Coca-Cola was able to get the mobile carriers to lower their minimum donation. It used to be, I believe, $10 to make a text message donation. They were able to change that to $1. So there was some innovation sort of on the back end. But whether it's the text messaging, it's the Macy's Believe now has a, I don't know the name for the technology, but it lets the kids take a picture with some of the characters associated with the initiative. So there's some of those little elements, but overall they're pretty much like meat and potatoes kind of cause marketing.
Great, kind of back to the basics there during the holiday season. I just want to remind everybody, because a couple questions have come in about access to the slides, and I want to remind everybody that what I said at the beginning of the session, which is that we'll be distributing a recording of the webinar sometime tomorrow. So if you did register, you will receive a recording of this session. So no worries there. Sarah, one final question, and I'll have you answer this, and maybe I can jump in on a couple of points as well. But the question is, during the study, did you find that consumers prefer when companies combine their volunteer and donation efforts? And again, it's sort of this idea of a multifaceted approach. Is there anything that reflected that is a good practice?
We didn't ask that question specifically, but I think it's pretty clear, particularly among Americans, when you look at the different approaches they want companies to take. It's everything. It's the full portfolio, as I mentioned. So, I would take away from that, make donations was 84%, volunteerism, donating, employee time and expertise was 86%. So it's really part and parcel of a multifaceted program. So I think absolutely there's a lot of power in and a lot of expectation that companies are not just going to have a siloed solution to an issue, that it's going to have many facets, including philanthropy and volunteerism.
Right, and I think I'll just piggyback on that in saying that there's multiple ways to engage your audiences, and whether it's a contest that you're running or changing your packaging and getting the consumer attention that way, or getting people out into the field to volunteer. There's many different ways that you can engage your audiences, and that it's really just a matter of having those options available so that individuals can get involved in the way that they want to. So it's something that we find as a volunteer organization is giving people the power of choice is really powerful, and whether that's for a volunteer initiative or other ways to get involved in whatever the cause or issue is that the organization is supporting is really important.
Mm-hmm. And this is a little supplemental, but I would add, we didn't focus on employees in this survey, but we all know employees are the strongest ambassador for a company's programs. And, we did see that in bits and pieces as we spoke with our experts in Brazil. Employees are really becoming sort of the sound piece for especially retail companies to speak to consumers about the efforts of either that company or the brands that it sells. So we know that employees and other data that we have, they can make or break a sale. They can really promote a program and inspire consumers to get involved as well. So I think that sort of piggybacks a little bit on what you were mentioning.
And again, just to reinforce that companies can be a powerful force in social good, no matter how you look at it or what your initiative is. And so thank you, Sarah, for this discussion and inspiring all of us and thinking about how we can get involved in sort of the marketplace there. Just a couple quick reminders before we break as well. To stay involved and up to date with VolunteerMatch and the VPNs that we have each month, definitely follow our blog, volunteeringatcsr.org, and follow us on Twitter. It's VM_solutions. That's a great way to connect with us. Sherry and I are on our Twitter handle all the time, so say hello to us and follow us. And just a reminder of next month's session, we are going to be joined by Megan Strand, the Director of Communications for the Cause Marketing Forum. She just published a white paper recently of what she calls the 800-pound gorilla, which is using Facebook for social good. So she'll be joining us next month on December 13th. So look out for the invite for that. And again, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us all your thoughts and insights about the research, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Thanks, everyone, for listening in. We'll see you next time.